I'm Pauline Donnelly, broker and owner of Donnelly & Co., an independent real estate brokerage with offices in Boston and Martha's Vineyard. I'm also a certified coach, and this is Ask Me Really, a podcast where I answer the real questions that come up for real estate agents in their business. This podcast is my attempt to answer questions the way I would in a real coaching session. No filler or fluff, just the real answer. Every week, I will answer a question from an agent. The questions will always be anonymous. This week's question is this. Dear Pauline, I had a listing appointment last week. My CMA-supported 1.150, 1,150,000, and the seller seemed to agree with my pricing. However, they said they wanted to list $200,000 higher at 1,350,000 because, in their words, they wanted to give themselves room to negotiate. I tried to hold my ground because I really think at the higher price their property will be overpriced and the market can't support it. I'm not sure I handled the conversation very well, and I'm not sure I'm going to get this listing. I'd like to be better prepared next time this conversation happens. How can I convince a seller that overpricing their home is not a good strategy? Well, thank you for that question, and I'm pretty sure you're not the only agent dealing with this kind of situation. I know I have. First of all, let's talk about what you did do well. You held your ground, and that's not easy when a listing is on the line, and a lot of agents in that moment struggle with this. A lot of agents will feel the listing slipping away, they'll start to do the mental calculation, and then they agree to the seller's number without actually believing it's the right one. And then they spend the next 6 weeks managing the consequences of that decision. So your instinct was correct, and I want to give you credit for that. There is a way to have this conversation with a seller so that you can hold your position on the pricing, but also bring the seller with you rather than leave them feeling overruled. The first thing I want to point out to you, the strategy that your seller is describing, that your seller is hoping for, doesn't exist. Your seller is operating on the assumption that a buyer will make a low offer, giving them the opportunity to negotiate down from that high number. But you know, and I know, this isn't how it works. This strategy that your seller believes could happen is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how buyers actually think and how they operate when they're making an offer. This type of negotiation that your seller is imagining requires a buyer who sees the home, wants the home, and then decides to make a low offer. But that's not what happens when a home is overpriced. Buyers don't negotiate it down. They filter it out. And that's the distinction that matters a lot. It's important to help a seller understand this. A buyer who is qualified to buy up to 1.2 million is searching within a specific price band. And that's how buyers think and search for their home. They're not just browsing everything on the market and then mentally adjusting. They're looking at properties priced for people in their position with their specific search parameters and the number at which they have been qualified or pre-approved. So your listing at 1,350,000, even though it's an appropriate property for them if priced rightly, never appears in their search. They don't see it, they don't form a view on it, they don't decide to lowball it because it simply doesn't exist for them. It has been filtered out. So think about this. The buyers who do see it are qualified at 1,350,000 and above. Those buyers have correctly priced options in their range, so they're not going to offer 15% below the asking price on this one. And then this is what happens. I'm sure you've seen it happen. I'm sure you've experienced it. The listing sits, days on market accumulate, and the seller who was confident starts to become anxious. And eventually, you're having a price reduction conversation from a weakened position because now there's a stigma on the property and you're starting from behind. And I guarantee you this, your seller will never tell you that you were right and they were wrong. Overpricing is not a conservative strategy. In fact, it's not a strategy at all. It's the riskiest thing a seller can do. And I'm going to repeat that. Overpricing is the riskiest thing a seller can do. And helping them understand that before you leave the appointment is part of the job. So what do you actually say when you're faced with this conversation? Understanding this concept is the first step, your understanding of this concept. And it's important because in the moment when most agents cave or get combative, you, if you understand what the message is you want to get across to the seller, are going to be able to articulate it confidently. The goal isn't to win the argument with your seller. The goal is to make sure that your seller understands what they're actually deciding about the price for their property. You might say something like this to your seller. I want to make sure that we're aligned on how buyers actually work before we settle on a number for your home. Most buyers today are searching within a price band based on what they're pre-approved for. If they're pre-approved to 1.2 million, they're not seeing your home at 1,350,000. They don't negotiate it down, they filter it out entirely. The negotiation that you're describing doesn't have a chance to start because those buyers are never going to arrive at your property. I don't want to push back on you. I want you to understand how buyers work, how buyers think, and I want us to go in with a strategy that's going to work for you. So if you say something like this to your seller, you're not telling them that they're wrong. You're explaining something to them about how buyers operate, and it's based on your experience working with buyers and your expertise in the market. You're not just asking them to trust you blindly, but you're showing them and explaining to them how buyers actually behave. And think about your own buyers that you have worked with. Tell a story, use an example. That's a much stronger position and it's much harder for your seller to argue with. Okay, but we've all been in those listing appointments where the seller gets it or they tell you that they do, but they still want to start high. And you feel that if you don't agree, you're going to lose the listing. So it can get a little nuanced here. And truthfully, there isn't one right answer to this. There are agents who feel strongly that you either list at the right price or you don't take the listing. And I respect that. If the property is going to sit and become a story in your market, there's an argument for walking away from it in the first place. But not every agent can do that or wants to do that. And there is another approach worth considering. A conditional agreement. So you take the listing at the number the seller wants to list at. But before you leave the room, before you sign the contract, you have a pre-agreement on a reassessment timeline for the price. So you might say something like this to the seller. We can start by testing the market at a higher number, but I'd like us to agree now on a strategy. If we don't have a serious showing in the first 14 days, that's the market telling us something, and we should revisit the price immediately. Can we agree on that? I've coached agents who actually write this into the listing contract and have the seller sign it. It's not a bad idea. And this changes the framing completely. The seller isn't being proven wrong later because you've agreed with them. They have agreed to it in advance that the market will give you an answer on the price, and now it has. So then the price reduction conversation becomes a fulfillment of an agreement that you made previously, and it's not a defeat for the seller. You might say, is that giving ground? Maybe, but it's also giving ground strategically with a very clear path forward built in, rather than you just simply acquiescing and hoping for the best. So back to the agent who sent this question. I hope you get the listing. You may or may not, and it may depend on things that you can't control. but I want you to know that holding your recommendation was the right instinct. Hopefully what we've done today is build a framework around that instinct so that next time you can hold your position with more confidence and more clarity. And if you do get the listing and the seller still wants to go with their number, it's not too late to go back to them proactively with data before the market makes the case for you passively. Sellers respect agents who return with information. This is what I'd like you to take away from today. Holding your price recommendation isn't stubbornness. It's not inflexibility. It's the most protective thing you can do for your seller. The agent who caves the listing appointment isn't being kind. They're actually delaying a much harder conversation and exposing their seller to a lot of risk in the process. When a seller says, I want you to remember this, when a seller says, we'll start high and we're willing to negotiate down, what they're really saying to you is that they haven't yet understood how buyers think and how buyers behave. And that's not their failure, that's your cue. Your job is to explain the process clearly without making them feel foolish, and then let them make an informed decision. Buyers don't negotiate overpriced homes down, they filter them out. And once your seller understands that, the whole conversation will change. You can't control what they decide, but you can control whether they understand what they're deciding. That's the job. Thank you for being here. If you have a question you'd like me to address on a future episode, send it to Pauline at askmereally.com. I read every email that comes in, and your question might just be the next episode. This is Ask Me Really. I'm Pauline Donnelly. I'll see you next week.